Hello and welcome to this episode of the Growthology podcast. I'm your host, Carlos Hidalgo, and with me today, I have Drew Smith, CEO of Attributa. Drew, welcome to Growthology.
Thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate it.
So, Drew, I always like to on our podcast kind of trace back where the connection was made. And I first heard your name, I think it was about a year ago, when I was meeting with one of the Adobe reps, my friend Jay Mitchell, and he said, "Hey, are you familiar with these guys, Attributa, Drew Smith? You guys have to connect. They're doing some great things around attribution." And just hearing you, it seems like you guys speak the same language. So up until recently, we hadn't even met in person. We just met over Zoom and did have the opportunity to finally connect at Adobe Summit. And so here we are, pretty quick from first meeting to getting you on the podcast. And I'm thrilled you decided to join.
Yeah. It's such a small world in B2B in this area because, we had the mutual connection in Jay, and then we found out we had other mutual connections as well, like Chris Arundale. So it's such a small world.
It really is. When people ask me, what do you do? I said, I work in a niche of a niche of a niche. And eventually, if you're in B2B marketing, whether it's strategy or technology or even B2B sales, I think you probably within about 3 to 4 minutes, you'll name a name and they're, oh, I know that person. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. It's super small. So did you get caught up in Eclipse Mania yesterday?
No, I was stuck in the house, and where I'm at in Phoenix, we only had a partial eclipse, so it didn't even really get that dark outside. So, no, I did not. What about yourself?
Yeah, our town kind of forced us into it because we were in the path of totality for, I don't know, like a minute and a half. But so my town in upstate New York, I don't know, 750, 800 full-time residents. Summertime, it grows quite a bit because of the lake. But I kid you not, I live right on Main Street, which is a state route. And we had probably 9 hours of bumper-to-bumper traffic.
Wow.
In the history, I've been coming up here and since the early 70s, I've never seen anything like it. And
Wow.
It was just insanity. My wife works part-time down at the restaurant in town, one of the restaurants, and she said it was an hour and a half wait for people to get in, and it was just madness. And I'm like, this is for 4 minutes or in our place, a minute and a half of complete totality or the path of totality. But it was, I should have made t-shirts and printed off 1,000 and sold it. I would have made a lot of money.
Absolutely. Well, something to think about next time.
I'm prepared for 44. But yeah, it was cool to look at, but I wouldn't travel for it but for some people, I think that's their jam.
Yeah.
So speaking about B2B, real quick question we like to ask all of our guests. If you were not in B2B or doing what you're doing in B2B, leading Attributa, what would you be doing?
I've been thinking about how to answer this question since I knew you were going to ask me this question. It's a tough one. I think that, so my original major in college was broadcast journalism. I specifically wanted to get into sports journalism, preferably being on ESPN. Obviously, that has not happened, but I would probably guess that if I weren't in B2B, I would probably be doing some sort of sports journalism, whether that be my own podcast about one of the local teams here or more formal journalism around sports. I don't know, but I would probably be doing something around sports journalism. And maybe even I've found recently as well that, my love of sports honestly came from when I was a little kid. I was enthralled by sports statistics, which it's funny because now I work in statistics and data and analysis, but for marketing. So it's entirely possible that if I had gotten into sports journalism, that I probably would have navigated into sports statistics and done something there as well. So just because for some reason, numbers, data, stats just works well with my brain. So probably one of those two.
Well, statistics definitely has dominated the sports scene as of late.
Oh, yeah.
Crazy. So you're from Arizona. Are you a D-backs fan? Are you baseball, football? Do you kind of go across the spectrum?
Yeah, I'm football, hockey, baseball. Not big on basketball, but I support the Phoenix Suns, particularly when they're in the playoffs. But yeah, I'm a fan of all the local sports teams here. So Cardinals, Coyotes, and Diamondbacks are at the top of the list.
All right. Well, sometime over a beer, we'll sit down and talk baseball. I will watch any game that's on at any time. I'm a diehard New York Yankee fan. Grew up that way. Same with you. I was always enthralled with sports. To me, there's nothing like walking up a tunnel to your seats and seeing the glow of the lights and just how vibrant everything is. I still remember my first NFL game ever, Giants versus Cowboys back in their heyday. And so, yeah, I love sports. My son is a statistics geek.
Okay.
He can pull out all these things. And, the older I get, I kind of concentrate on baseball and football. But it's a wild game. And he actually has a friend of his who was an accounting major at Grant, went into accounting, and then just by happenstance ran into a guy. And long story short, he now works for the Pirates doing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, yeah, maybe after your success here with Attributa, you can get into your sports analytics career.
Yeah, we'll see what happens.
So, Drew, you're on our podcast, but I want to congratulate you. You just launched your own podcast, Attribution Nation. So congrats on that. I know what it takes to get all that together, to get your guests. I would love to just know how it's going. And for our listeners, go and tune into Attribution Nation. You'll get a great education. But how's it going so far? And what have you learned through that process?
Yeah. First off, thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of work. We're super proud and excited to have launched that this week, and it's going great so far. It's just so much fun. And I've learned a ton just about how to do podcasts and things like that, but also from the guests that we've had on. We've taken a little bit of a unique approach with the podcast that we're doing in a mini series format. And our first mini series is 5 episodes where we kind of talk about the history of attribution. And we were fortunate to get some amazing guests, including Aaron Bird, the co-founder and former CEO of Visible. We have Eric Westerkamp, the CEO of Caliber Mind. We have Lars Grunegard, the CEO and co-founder of Dream Data. And we have Amir Atli, the CRO and co-founder of Hockey Stack. And we're talking to these guys about, where attribution has been, how it even got started, like what was the original problem that you were solving for with your software way back when you first started, and then that evolution process, and then also where it's going in the future. And it's been super interesting. Some of the things that I've learned just through talking to these folks is changing the way that I'm approaching, being the CEO of Attributa. I mean, I'm learning things that aren't even necessarily attribution specific, which is just great because, it's you can learn so many things from different people, particularly when you don't expect it, So it's been a great experience. I've learned so much. Yeah, it's been great.
Well, I'm excited to tune into it. I know it's going to be great. And that is the one thing I love about podcasting is the people you get to meet. In a previous life, I did one with my wife, and it's amazing that people are always like, oh, I could never get that guest. I'm like, well, have you asked? And it is amazing when you ask the people who just turn up and say, yeah. And I think my favorite was we interviewed a world record triathlete. She's a woman over in the UK that set all kinds of world records. And at the time, she was preparing to break the Guinness Book of World Records for the distance or something, or the hours on an indoor bike. So
oh, wow.
Biking, and it was kind of right where COVID was, like we still weren't sure if we're coming out of this thing. It was just a fascinating discussion. And people are like, how did you get her on your podcast? I'm like, we asked. Yeah. So if you're sitting there listening and you're saying, hey, I want to start a podcast, just go do it. It's fun. You get to meet people. As you said, that you learn so much. I'm excited to learn from you on this episode.
Yeah, it's been very rewarding so far. So I can't wait to get further into it.
Good. Well, we'll have to swap stories back and forth, and we will post a link to your show in our show notes So I want to get to your area of expertise, attribution. You're talking about the history of attribution on your podcast. I did a little watching, went to your website, did some viewing of some of the videos that you have posted there, which are really great, really educational. But you said something which was really interesting. And one of the first ones that I watched is that marketing attribution is polarizing in the marketing world. And I would love for you to explain what made you arrive at that conclusion. I've never thought of it that way. Doesn't mean it's not, but why is that, or why do you believe that? And then what have you seen in organizations that embrace it? What have they done to change that and make that not something polarizing, but maybe unifying?
Yeah, I think that marketing attribution is polarizing in the marketing world for multiple reasons. So number one is it's hard. It's not easy to do. If you think about B2B buying experiences, you have multiple people on the buying committee. You have upwards of, when you're selling into enterprises, you're 12, 16, 18-month sales cycles, hundreds of touch points throughout that entire calendar cycle. And it's difficult. And anytime something's difficult, you're going to have people that don't want to bother with it and think it's a waste of time. It's also, not only is it difficult, it requires a skill set that a lot of marketers don't have. And this is not a knock on marketers in any way, shape, or form. It's not. It's simply a matter of the fact that there are a lot of marketers that got into marketing through the creative disciplines: graphic design, web design, development, copywriting, literature. I know so many folks that have had all these very circuitous routes into marketing, and none of them are tied to data and statistical analysis. And so you have marketers that it's not that they can't learn this and that they can't do this. It's a muscle that they haven't flexed in years, in sometimes decades. And you can't expect somebody that hasn't flexed a muscle in decades to suddenly be very, very good flexing that muscle with something as complex as B2B marketing attribution. This is not easy stuff. You can't expect a marketer that comes from a creative discipline to suddenly understand complex, large data models. It's just not going to happen. So it's a skill set that a lot of marketers don't have and haven't needed to use in a long time. So it makes it even more confusing and more difficult. And then the other piece of the puzzle is there's so many different ways to measure marketing, and attribution is just one of the ways. It's not the only way. There's lots of ways to measure marketing performance. And when you have so many different ways of measuring marketing performance, there's going to be people that prefer one over the other. And so they're going to say that, well, this methodology is the best way to do it because it's the one that I know the best and it's the one I'm most comfortable with. So you have a lot of different reasons why it's become so polarizing. It's part of what we're doing at Attributa, and part of the reason why I launched Attribution Nation is to help kind of demystify it and to break down a lot of the misconceptions that are out there about attribution, so that we can see more and more organizations using it as a tool in their toolkit. It's not the end all be all, but it is a really damn good tool that organizations should be using. The success that we see organizations have with that is reduced wasted spend. So we see orgs all the time that can pinpoint and identify campaigns that are producing nothing in terms of pipeline and revenue. Right? They're spending money on them. And when I talk about campaigns here, I'm talking about, it could be, a paid search campaign. It could be a specific event that they participate in, whether it's a large conference or an event that they're hosting themselves. Those are the types of campaigns we're talking about here, all across the gamut of all the different channels and tactics that marketing is using. And they find the areas where their spend is producing nothing at all, right? And it's helping them identify those things and then say, let's do less of that. And oh, by the way, now that we've freed up this budget from doing less of the stuff that doesn't work, what are the things that are working, that are correlating to pipeline and revenue? And let's add more spend there, right? And see if that can increase that pipeline and revenue even further. That's the biggest area of success that we see organizations seeing with attribution, is finding the stuff that isn't working, and doing less of that and then moving that budget to the things that are actually working.
Yeah, but the excuse of, well, we've always been to that show. I mean, that doesn't justify the spend. What will our competitors say if we don't show up at this event and spend $150,000, even though we're going to get zero revenue for it? So you're breaking down that. And I hear you speak, and I agree with everything you just said, especially the hard and the complex. But I sit there and say, if I'm in any role of marketing leadership, doesn't even have to be a CMO, but if I have budget authority, if I have spend, even if it's hard, wouldn't I want to know what you just described so I can be precise with my spend? And when the inevitable comes, whether it's this year, next year, or the year after, where the organization says you need to cut your budget, wouldn't you want the confidence to say, okay, if we pull from here, let's say it's a 10% cut, this is going to be the impact to our growth and the impact to pipeline and revenue. To me, that's like, I don't care how hard it is. I'll walk through hell and back to make sure I've got that insight. So with your experience, maybe everybody doesn't think like I do. They don't think like you do. What is that blocker? Is it more of a change management initiative that they're trying to wrap their heads around? Is it they've got so many other competing priorities? Because to me, that attribution is so important, especially if I can tell the story and justify my existence even more.
Yeah. So first up, before I answer that, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which was about events. And well, what happens if I just stop going to that event? What are my competitors going to say? So in a previous career, I was an event manager for 7 years. I coordinated over 100 events a year for a large Fortune 500 company. And there were multiple different classifications of events that we participated in. And some of those events were truly nothing other than visibility. If that event got us $0 in pipeline or revenue, which considering at the time I was in this career, we didn't have all the fancy attribution tools that we have now. We couldn't actually track that. But if you could track that, it would show 0 pipeline, 0 revenue, but you still have to be there from a visibility and perception standpoint. If you were to not show up, it would look bad and it wouldn't. So there's events that you go to that increase pipeline and revenue, and there's events that you go to that are prevention, where they prevent you from losing market share. All they do is help you maintain. The thing that organizations need to do when they start getting into attribution or any kind of marketing measurement philosophy is understand the goal of each of those events. Have stated goals. We're going to this event. Our goal is not pipeline and revenue because that's not the type of event this is. Our goal is X, Y, and Z. Cool. Measure against X, Y, and Z the goal of that event. There's an old saying. I'm going to butcher this, of course, but because I'm just memorizing it off the top of my head here, or remembering it from the top of my head here. But I think it's Albert Einstein, and it's a quote that says, it's something along the lines of, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, that fish will live its life thinking it's stupid. Well, a fish isn't supposed to climb a tree. So X campaign isn't supposed to create net new leads. So if we judge it based on its ability to create net new leads, it's going to look like it failed. So you have to have a clearly stated goal and objective for each campaign to be able to properly measure it, right? So that's kind of like the answer to some of that question about that event. Do we not go next year? What's going to happen if we don't go? You have to know that about each event that you're going to be able to make the proper decisions and be able to measure it appropriately.
Well, and I'm so glad you highlighted that, because I speak to so many marketers who, even campaigns, multi-channel campaigns, and then you say, well, what are the goals of this campaign? Oh, to generate leads. How many leads? What's the average sales process? How many are going to be in pipeline? You start to get to that level of granularity, and it's almost like you're speaking Greek to them because they haven't thought through that process. So I love that you highlighted that as, hey, if you're going to an event simply for visibility and to make sure that your brand is known, just state that as fact and say, this is what we're going to be. So now it's how many people stopped in, how many people came to our speaking session, how many people did we get to scan their badge or have a conversation with. Those are such different metrics than how many qualified leads did we get from this show, or how many qualified leads do we get from this email campaign that we're doing? So I love that you've highlighted that. And I think it's something that marketers need to really understand, define those goals up front and make sure that you're tracking to those. But to your point, it's hard, it's difficult. So I come back to, even though it's hard and difficult, there's a good on the other side, because now I can demonstrate to an organization, you gave me this much, I return this much. You pull this much, we're going to decrease this much. So where's that blocker in your experience as you talk with marketers who may be a little bit resistant to going down the attribution road?
Yeah, so I think the blockers are several things. So you mentioned this when you asked the question the first time, competing priorities, absolutely. If you ask 100 organizations, what's more important, driving more leads or attribution, 90% of them are going to say driving more leads. Regardless of whether you can report on the outcome of those leads, we need to drive more leads. That's because marketing departments are under pressure from VPs of sales, CROs, CEOs, CFOs to drive leads. That is still the number one metric in marketing is leads. It shouldn't be, but it is. And there's a lot of education that needs to be done around that. Data put on the back burner because we got to drive more leads. Then you think about all the other competing priorities that go into all this stuff. It's a joke and a meme at this point, but what's the first thing every new CMO does when they come in to a new organization? It's, we're going to redo the brand or we're going to redo the website. One of those two is the thing that always pops up. So data takes a backseat to redoing the website and redoing the brand. Always. The other thing that I think comes into play is that when you look at the average tenure of a CMO, the average tenure of a CMO is going down and down and down all the time. I think right now, the average tenure of a CMO is something like a year and a half. The last time I read the stat.
Wow.
So when you talked about the inevitable coming, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but 2-3 years down the road, and we have to get budget pulled back, do you think CMOs, with the average time frame of being CMOs a year and a half in an organization, are they thinking 2-3 years down the road? No, they're not. They're thinking, how do I maximize right now, this quarter and next quarter, to make sure that I last longer than a year and a half, right?
Self-preservation.
I think that there's just, and again, I'm not saying this to knock on any CMOs. It's the reality of the environment. CMOs are put under tremendous pressure from CFOs and CEOs to deliver more results with less budget. Mm-hmm. And that's a big driver of why CMOs only last about a year and a half in any organization, is because they get a lot of unreasonable and unattainable expectations. So it's not the CMO's fault. I'm not knocking the CMOs. It's the nature of the role right now is short-term gains, not long-term planning. It's just the nature of the role right now. So a lot of why data and attribution isn't prioritized is because of all of those competing priorities. For all of those different reasons, data just gets pushed to the back burner.
Yeah, and I hear that, and on one level it makes sense. But I also think if I'm in my first 90 days of a new CMO, the one thing I want to know is what is working, what is not working. Because I'm not going to make any changes, and you're right, it's either brand or the website. And every time they launch the website, then they're like, we're not crazy about our website, even though we just launched it. But I want to know, what is my contribution to pipeline? What is my contribution to revenue? Those are two things that I want to know. And I go back to my early days at McAfee, where a sales leader said to me, marketing's never done anything for me. Welcome to the company, but you're not going to do anything different. And this was long before we even had marketing automation. So I went through and I started to I called it my spreadsheet hell week of immersing myself into, and I realized he was right. Now, I wasn't even a director level at that point. I was at a manager level, but I made it my mission to use data to then say, here's how I can help you, but I need you to help me. And once they realized this guy really does want to help us, which meant not taking orders, but true collaboration, we did a lot of great things. So again, I appreciate the insight on the self-preservation, But if there are CMOs listening, I would say the best way to preserve your role and extend your tenure is to use the data.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sink your teeth into that, tell the story, discover what's wrong, then you can start fixing. Because if you just go in and start to fix, to your point, 18 months, that's going to continue to drop.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So one of the discussions I always hear in organizations is first touch, last touch, multi-touch, all these different ways to look at attribution. Kind of, I sometimes think in organizations, they use that as a way to stall, to go down that attribution road. Oh, we're still trying to figure out. And you're like, well, you've been discussing this now for 15 months, so you're going to make a decision. Well, what have you seen work? Is there a model that you prefer? And if so, then what, what is the justification for that?
Yeah, I think I have a different approach to attribution models than most folks, because most organizations look at attribution models as, well, we need to figure out which one's going to be right for us. The answer is one isn't right for your organization. They're all right for your organization. They answer different questions. An attribution model is a tool that answers a question. So a first touch attribution model answers the question, where do our leads come from that turn into opportunities and deals? The last touch attribution model, first off, we have to ask the question, last touch before what? Because is it last touch prior to MQL? Last touch prior to opportunity creation? Last touch prior to pipeline stage? Last touch prior to closed won? It could be any of those, right?
Sure.
They all answer different questions. Multi-touch answers multiple questions, but it's different questions than first touch and last touch. Self-reported answers a different question than all of those. So the answer isn't which one should we have. You should have all of them. And you use them as tools to answer different questions. They can't be answered by the other attribution models. It's like I use the analogy all the time of your attribution models are basically what you get when you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you go buy a set of 6 wrenches to take home for all your DIY projects at home. One of those wrenches is your first touch wrench. The other wrench is your last touch wrench for last touch prior to MQL. You get all your different last touch wrenches. Then you've got your multi-touch wrench. Then you get your self-reported wrench, and they all serve different purposes. So if you think about attribution models as tools that are used to answer different reporting questions, you don't have to paralyze yourself with trying to understand, well, which model should we use? It's not an organizational question. It's a report level question.
So it's really understanding what questions you want answered first.
Yeah. And there's also, so it's what questions do you want to get answered first, but it's also a maturity process, because you cannot get to multi-touch until you're at least decent at first touch and some level of last touch, because multi-touch leverages both first touch and last touch, right? So you start with most organizations start with first touch because it's the easiest lead source. Then they start working on last touch, and they have to answer the question, last touch in relation to what? But that just builds on top of first touch. And then the next step is usually going to be multi-touch, with self-reported fitting in there during some part of the journey. But it's related to what do you have the technical capabilities to deliver on, and what are the reports that you need answers to first.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned very briefly the technology piece, and I see organizations, and maybe I am busting on marketers now, even though I am one, the infatuation we have with technology. And I can only chalk that up to the fact that for so long, and I'm dating myself now, but for so long, there was no technology available. Now that there was, it's like the California gold rush, and I think there's 12,000 vendors now. But I've worked with clients who, hey, we bought this, or we bought this attribution, or we bought this measurement software, and it doesn't work. So we're throwing that out and we're buying another one. And then lo and behold, that one doesn't work. So, for those who have either gone down that road, they have an attribution software or are considering an attribution software, what would you say are the necessary steps to, hey, before you go and make that plunge, or before you go and swap out one for another, what are some fundamental things that you advise your clients on to say, These are the building blocks, the foundational elements you have to have in order to get the value out of that software purchase.
Yeah. So I'm going to boil all of that down into one term.
Sure.
And this one term is pretty all encompassing for how to be successful with attribution. And that one term is operational rigor. You have to have operational rigor to be successful with an attribution platform, period. Now, what do I mean by operational rigor? Let's break this down into the more granular pieces, the more actionable pieces. So number one, you have to have UTM strategy. If you don't have a UTM strategy, you're going to suck at any kind of marketing data, period. Now, what I mean by UTM strategy is I don't just mean that we've got a spreadsheet and we track UTM usage. What it means is that you have to have intentionally designed UTM values and you have to be consistent. You have to use the same value every single time for the same use case. If you don't have operational rigor and consistency in your UTM usage, you will fail, period. Software won't fix it. You will fail. The same thing has to happen. You have to have the same level of operational rigor when it comes to how you actually execute your campaigns. Do you use the same campaign type in Salesforce? Do you have the same campaign member statuses for that map to those campaign types? Do you use them consistently? Do you have 13 different campaign member statuses that indicate the word attended, including some with spelling mistakes and typos? If you do, you don't have operational rigor and you will fail, period. You have to have that operational rigor in place. Another one that comes into that is huge is operational rigor related to tracking sales activities. I talk to so many organizations that are like, well, we want to factor sales activities into our attribution modeling. Cool, we can do that. The software allows us to do that. Do you have a way of determining when a sales rep picks up a phone call, if they got a voicemail, a no answer, a wrong number, or a successful connection? If you cannot tell that in a systematic way in like one field with a pick list value, you don't have the operational rigor to do that. You have to have that in your system and in your processes to be successful. That is the one thing that when somebody's failing in attribution, 97% of the time, it's due to a lack of operational rigor.
That, first of all, I love that answer. I'm a big fan of that answer, and I'm going to use that term and I will give you credit. Every time you hear a bell ring, you'll know that I just used your term. We're big fans of, we talk about governance, and I think it's, we're different terms, but it's the same thing. I am amazed at the organizations though and I'm not talking like small, startup organizations or even mid-market. These are enterprise organizations where there is none, or it's, well, IT does that. And they dismiss the operations role. They dismiss the data steward or data analyst role. And they just want more content creators. They want more strategists. They need more field marketing. And I'm sitting there saying, you're already bloated in terms of an organization. Put some structure, put some formality around this discipline that's a growth driver for your organization. And so you've just affirmed that I'm not crazy. I mean, I'm crazy in other areas, but when it comes to this, that's kind of where it's at. And, what are you seeing marketers abdicate that governance or that operational rigor and saying, hey, that's an IT issue or that's an ops issue, I've got to just focus? Where is the breakdown or the resistance in that? Or is it back to there's just too much to do in any given day?
Yeah, I mean, I think where a lot of it comes into play is marketers being overwhelmed with too much going on, to be honest with you. I mean, work with organizations that have the strategies built, but the execution is the problem. And it's because we're creating shortcuts to increase speed to market, right? We're doing it the fast way, not the right way. And so organizations miss that operational rigor and they sacrifice that to speed and efficiency. And that's a prioritization that conversation that organizations have to have internally. What is our prioritization? Speed or process? Efficiency or data? And now I have a little bit of a technique that I use to introduce that you don't have to sacrifice speed and efficiency to maintain operational rigor. Our methodology is to make it easy and efficient to do the right thing, to make it hard and difficult to do the wrong thing. If you build the methodology in a way that makes it so that doing the right thing is the most efficient and fastest way to get it done, people will do it the right way. Yeah. You just have to make it easy.
Yep.
So, but that's the biggest problem is that we see is it's not necessarily the strategic design isn't there. Like, for example, with the UTMs, it's that the execution misses the mark because we're moving too quickly. Right. We're taking shortcuts. We're trying to be efficient. Next thing you know, we're using, 14 different UTMs that all mean the same thing. And our operational rigor is just out the window.
Yeah, and you can get really efficient at doing stuff poorly. And and I've always believed there's no shortcut to good marketing. There's no shortcut to good reporting or good attribution. But you said something else, which again, in my head, I'm like, this is why we get along. How do we simplify it? Doesn't mean it's not sophisticated, but how do we simplify it? How do we make it easy? Because I agree with you. I think there's so much being thrown at marketers on top of all of the nonsense that so many vendors are putting out there, where I'm just like, what I've seen in this marketplace is, let's just get back to basics. Let's simplify why marketing does what they do, and then we can make it work. Then we can actually demonstrate the value we bring to our customers and to the organization.
I point to the sign behind me that says simplicity scales, complexity fails probably once a week and I haven't changed the message on this sign in like a year because I just keep going back to it and going, look, right there. It says it right there on the sign. Yeah, it's simplicity. We got to get things, the more you can simplify things, particularly operational processes, then it just makes it easy to be consistent and have that operational rigor in place.
Sure. I love that sign too. I might, there's a couple of things I'm just going to grab from you, and then you know how it's going to be the first few times. Like, I heard this from Drew Smith at Attributa, and then it's, can't remember where I heard this. And then, 3 years I'll make it my own and you'll be suing me for trademark. So
fair enough.
Well, one last question for you. Because you mentioned at the beginning, right? It seems so enormous. And you talked about data, so my head's going to the need for data science. It's one question I'm asked is, if you were going to start a marketing department today or go in, what's the one, and you could only get one hire, I would hire a data analyst like that, just to be able to start making heads and tails. But beyond all that, if you're a marketing person, you're saying, I've been fighting this battle, I'm not getting any attention, or a new CMO, new marketing leader. We already talked about the tenure, we talked about all these things, but what are some of the more organizational dangers that exist if marketers continue to kick the can down the road or prioritize other things ahead of their attribution and getting really focused in on what they're doing for their organizations?
Yeah, I think from an organizational standpoint, one of the things, and you mentioned this earlier very briefly, but I want to kind of touch on it a little bit, is one of the biggest organizational risks we see is not having a dedicated marketing analyst. And the reason why this is a risk is very simple. If you put analysis of marketing performance in the hands of the people that are strategizing and creating and executing the campaigns, there will always be one critical factor that will cause issues with their analysis: bias.
Say that again?
All bias.
Sure.
Their own internal bias. It's impossible for somebody to objectively rate their performance without injecting their own personal bias into spinning the numbers and spinning the data to make themselves look good. I have this example that I use of an organization that we were working with that they had a field marketing team that was coordinating tons of events. And the field marketing team was told to, go analyze, here's all of your marketing attribution data, go analyze your events, figure out what's working and what's not working. And they went in such a wrong direction. They analyzed their performance was about maximizing the performance of their team, not about maximizing the performance of the business. And if they actually made the changes, so it was fortunate we caught this. Actually, this organization had had a conversation with me to like validate the analysis. And I was like, no, you cannot do this. It would have actually helped increase attribution for their team. But if they had implemented these changes, it would have reduced the overall pipeline and revenue generated by the organization at whole. So you can't put analysis in the hands of the people that are going to be reviewing it through the lens of bias. It is so important to have an unbiased, I almost refer to it as like the historian in the organization, that understands, hey, well, last year we had this weird anomaly, so we can't really do quarter over quarter comparison with last year because there was this weird anomaly. Like, you need somebody that is unbiased and has that more of a historian approach to this stuff. If you don't, you can have the best data in the world, but if the analysis is done through the lens of bias, it's not going to matter at all. You're going to make the wrong decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And some I had never even thought of. But yeah, it reminds me of when my boys were little and I said, let's go get mom a present for Mother's Day. And they're like, let's buy her a Buzz Lightyear. She'll really, right? So I think that's a huge point. And yeah, I think I'm still amazed that data analysts, marketing analysts are not, they just should be in every marketing organization. And I love how you talk about that. That is somebody who's purely objective. All I'm here is to make the data work. And then you also drew the distinction, which I think is huge. It's not about the benefit of marketing. It's what is benefiting the business, right? How is marketing truly becoming a driver of that growth for the organization, not department by department or tactic by tactic?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if marketing is contributing to pipeline and revenue in a positive way, every department within marketing is going to win because sales is going to want marketing to do more stuff. BDRs are going to want marketing to do more stuff. The CFO is going to want to give marketing more budget. If marketing is focusing on winning for the business, marketing as a department will win. It's no different. I mean, you're a sports guy. I equate it to being on the field, on a football field. You are playing your role, right? You've got to do your piece. If you do your piece and the team wins, you will get the recognition. But if you are acting selfishly to try to win an award, you might do something that causes your team the game. You might still win an award, but your team lost. So eventually, you're not going to have that job anymore because you get the reputation of being a selfish player, right? So if you're doing stuff that's, the right thing to do that benefits the team, everybody wins.
Yeah. And this is why Russell Westbrook has been traded a myriad of times and will win a ring.
Individual basketball player, not a team member, not a good team member.
No, absolutely not. And we could do a whole other podcast on that, maybe. So, Drew, thank you so much for your time. Where can, for listeners who want to track you down, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn under Andrew, Drew in parentheses, Smith. You can find the company page is also on LinkedIn, Attributa. Our website is attributa.io. And then you can find our podcast, Attribution Nation, on all the major streaming services. Just search for Attribution Nation and it'll come up.
Great. And we will put all of those links in the show notes so you can connect with Drew. So Drew, again, thank you for your time. Really exciting. You've got my head spinning, so I'm going to actually go for a run and think through all this stuff. I may have some follow-up questions for you, but really looking forward to doing more with you and your team in the year ahead. And I want to thank all of you for listening to Growthology. I know that you've learned something here, and that's really what this podcast is all about, is helping you in your growth-facing role. Make it a great day, and thank you for tuning in.